members of the O'Farrell family, global Irish everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Ronan's invitation to me to deliver this first memorial lecture for Patrick O'Farrell was certainly a great honour and a rather daunting challenge as well. I think I shall not sing tonight, certainly not in the lecture. I wondered how I should approach this, and I thought first of all I'd like to read to you an appreciation that I wrote some time ago of Patrick O'Farrell. Then I will move on to some reflections on Australia's Irish question as I've looked at it over the years and as friends of mine have looked at it. Try to tease out how our findings and my approaches have intersected with Patrick's. And then I'll go on to the related question of Ireland's Australian question, the related matter of Ireland's Australian question, which Ronan actually in his introductory remarks has already raised to some degree. Is there such a question? In any case, first of all, let me offer my appreciation to Patrick James O'Farrell, 1933 to 2003. Hallo, death. So, with characteristic morbid jauntiness, Patrick O'Farrell began the final chapter of his third and most idiosyncratic excursion among the colonial Irish, vanished kingdoms. Death was a long-standing preoccupation for a man afflicted in his mid-40s by a severe stroke that forced him to relearn the basic skills of walking, talking, and writing. His recovery, though incomplete, enabled Patrick O'Farrell to produce a sequence of important and experimental studies of the Irish in Australasia, which continue to inform, tease, and provoke all those concerned with migration and ethnicity. As the later works made explicit, his attempt to unravel the mystery of Irishness and its meaning for emigrants and their descendants was one of the later stages in a personal quest for self-definition. This quest was clearly shared with a multitude of non-academic readers and buyers for whom O'Farrell was self-consciously a spokesman. During a debate on his work in 1990, he averred that simply the possession of his works had given Catholics and Irish Australians a sense of better identity and a real sense of pride in themselves, which they had been lacking. As this utterance suggests, O'Farrell was himself a proud man, conscious of his achievement as an historian and a writer who touched the suppressed yearnings of ordinary people, some ordinary people, as he put it. No historian working in Australia since Manning Clark had taken his quest and his achievement more seriously or had better cause for pride. The parallels with Manning Clark are striking. Both had high ambition and a developing sense of mission as historians. Both were concerned with the interplay of materialism and spirituality. Both treated early Australia as a testing ground for great ideals, salvation, enlightenment, socialism, which was at once arid, dispiriting, yet susceptible to social and moral experiment. Both were inclined to translate individual human stories into parables. Both were dialecticians who delighted in formulating ingenious, provocative, and sometimes inconsistent arguments. As O'Farrell affirmed in 1985, he sought out dramatic situations requiring a dramatic format. Both had a wide range of literary and cultural references, as has already been mentioned, which coloured their interpretation of ordinary lives. O'Farrell also shared, if I may say so, some of Clark's flaws in his recourse to contorted, emotive, and sometimes purple prose, but most of us are guilty of that, his impatience with pedestrian facts and generalizations based on statistical aggregation, his perverse reluctance to supply precise citations, and his tendency to substitute commentary, often speculative or discursive, for systematic reporting of relevant evidence. Both, in short, were creative writers using the materials of history. Despite these affinities, or because of them, each was wary of the other. In Vanished Kingdoms, O'Farrell asserted that Clark's A History of Australia, though a masterwork, was a highly idiosyncratic testament from a once dominant Protestant elite, lamenting its own demise and taken up with its own present confusions and torments. Historians of the Australian establishment tradition, to which, oddly, the maverick Manning Clark was assigned, had squeezed out the wider concerns and character of the underclass of Irish Catholics, the group for whom Patrick O'Farrell performed as a champion. But the strange thing about this critique is the ease with which it could be reapplied to Patrick O'Farrell himself, who by 1985 had come to lament the near paralysis of the once mighty Catholic Empire in Australia, until to mull over the sources of its confusions and torments, and to contemplate the possibility of generating a specifically and individually Australian Catholicism to recapture the imagination of the laity and the young. Admittedly, O'Farrell never relinquished his strong attachment to the Catholic Church or his sense of the close presence of God in the world, whereas Manning Clark rapidly shed his father's Anglicanism and spent his life flirting with faith, but resisting seduction in that regard, only to surrender on his deathbed, according to his Jesuit mentor. Yet O'Farrell, the sceptical insider, was no less trenchant in his critique of hypocrisy and abuse of power by churchmen than Manning Clark, the spellbound outsider. Both patrol that fine line between sacred and profane with irony and wit, drawing on their own ambivalence to illuminate the mentality of Australia's early spiritual colonists. Though O'Farrell's historical focus shifted over time from organised labour to Irishness via Catholicism, all three themes had personal resonance for the son of an Irish Catholic labour organiser, brought up in Greymouth on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island. He sensed Ireland through his parents, both natives of the Boris O'Kane district in Tipperary, who had emigrated separately just before the Great War and married in New Zealand. His father, Paddy, a policeman's son, had established his national credentials through hurling. His ankle was shattered and permanently deformed during a match in 1908, and by embellishing his surname with the prefix O after emigration. Yet Paddy Sr.'s feelings about Ireland, soured by his mother's remarriage and absorption in her second family, were expressed mainly through silence and occasional expostulation. "What has Ireland ever done for me?" Patrick's upbringing in New Zealand's most Irish district and education by the Maoists at the local high school gave him instinctive understanding of the somewhat synthetic Irishness fostered among the children and descendants of Irish settlers. He heartily embraced this Catholic culture, becoming a golden boy, so he wrote, and head prefect, though not matching his brother, who entered the Dominicans. His tastes remained simple and unpretentious, amidst the hedonistic excess of fin de siècle Sydney, and those fortunate enough to enjoy the hospitality of Patrick and Deirdre, as I was on occasion, his chief intellectual critic and collaborator at each stage of his research and writing, felt themselves transported to the coziness once associated with an Irish kitchen. Intensely proud of the achievements of his 5 children, who also became collaborators, he inhabited a domestic world, I thought, not too far removed from the vanished kingdoms recreated in his work. More than most historians, he dwelt on the personal springs of his scholarly work, the role of chance in prompting each enterprise, and also the inevitability in retrospect of his intellectual pilgrimage. The lacunae in each study prompted the next. How could one understand Australasian labour without studying the influence of the Catholic Church, or the communal power of that church without deciphering the Irish legacy of most Catholics? Concurrently, his focus shifted from individual biography in Harry Holland, Militant Socialist, to institutional hierarchies in the succession of studies beginning with the Catholic Church in Australia, and then to more or less ordinary lives, as chronicled from different perspectives in his 3 major studies of Irish settlers in Australasia. By studying the prelates and leaders of Australian Catholicism, he sought to reveal the mechanisms which had created and sustained a hierarchical and clerically controlled church with a record of great achievement of spirit. O'Farrell exulted in the church's triumph in moulding an artificially Irish community through Catholic schooling, even as he deplored its counterproductive attempts to enforce political discipline. In later work, however, his preoccupation with power gave way to fascination with the linked psychological functions of religious and ethnic attachment. This shift was reflected in ever more exclamatory prose and speculative argument, often exciting, sometimes, to some of us, infuriating. Prometheus was unbound at last. The first and maybe best of the trilogy was a sustained meditation on the letters of Irish emigrants to their families, mostly in Protestant Ulster. O'Farrell relished this hitherto alien terrain and the opportunity to subvert the facile equation between Australian Irishness and Catholicism, which had warped most previous studies. He used letters to display the mixed feelings of emigrants about both countries, their sometimes morbid attempts to foster emotional links with home, and their frequent, if indirect, admission of disenchantment or failure in the new environment. By concentrating on mainly well-endowed Protestants, he was able to show that the experience of spiritual displacement was not unique to poor Catholics, and that Irish Protestants, once displaced, often preferred the company of their Catholic compatriots to the overbearing English. In The Irish in Australia, published 2 years later, in 1986, O'Farrell elaborated these insights on the basis of much wider documentation. His most striking general conclusion was that until very recently, the Irish have been the dynamic factor in Australian history. That is, the galvanizing force at the center of the evolution of our national character. By challenging British religious and political dominance, the Irish provided a constant liberalizing and creative irritant, and embodied, focused, and sustained the principle of protest, retreating somewhat from the pluralism of letters from Irish Australia. He further declared that the pivot of this thesis of Irish dynamic influence is the Catholic Gaelic Irish. Though dubious and untestable, in my opinion, this claim drew attention to the reproduction and competition in Australia of different sets of values drawn from disparate old world cultures. Australia should not be pictured as a tabula rasa, a melting pot, or an outpost of Britain, but as a theatre of conflict between distinct peoples with antagonistic cultural legacies. In Vanishing Kingdoms, O'Farrell used a medley of his own family's correspondence and other testimony to amplify his controversial supposition that Catholic Irish settlers, especially the early convicts, brought with them the residue of a proud culture of great antiquity, with their own language, civilization, and value structure. Steeped in the supposedly feudal and pre-modern allegiances of the hidden Ireland, they tried to recover and replicate these submerged values in the Australian wilderness. O'Farrell maintained that the invention of Australia allowed the Irish to step back again into their past, or rather an idealized version of it, until the 1840s at least. Later Irish emigrants, though superficially modern and anglicised, retained a psychological need to recover the lost Gaelic ways in Australia, so conferring on Irishness the elusive and mysterious qualities which so entranced Patrick O'Farrell. This need was imperfectly expressed through the aggressive mission of the Catholic Church, now seen as the principal but not the only vehicle for the Irish colonial conquest, exhibited through the achievement of tolerance, equality, democracy, opportunity. Now, read cold, these claims seem to some of us implausible and contradictory. How did values sometimes identified by O'Farrell as pre-Christian find expression through Romanized Catholicism? Why did feudal allegiances express themselves in celebration of democracy? Yet, as in all of O'Farrell's work, the thrust of the underlying question survives the apparent inconsistency of particular arguments. Like so many older Australasians, not to mention restless hybrid academics like myself, he felt a growing need to re-identify himself as something else. By using historical sources to tease out the spiritual and mental impulses and deprivations creating that need, he challenged historians of other ethnic groups to disprove his extravagant claims for the cultural uniqueness of Irish Australians. Patrick O'Farrell was more of an Australian, I suggest, than a New Zealander, having emigrated across the Tasman shortly after graduating from the University of Canterbury to work towards his doctorate in 1961 at the ANU. His entire teaching career was spent at the University of New South Wales, where he secured a lectureship in 1959, a personal chair in 1972, and as you've heard, the first Scientia research professorship in 1998. He exhibited his new allegiances by writing a lively history of that university and taking out Australian citizenship. Yet he had seriously contemplated moving on from his adopted Australian home to Ireland, and occupied visiting posts at University College Dublin in 1965-6 and 1972-3. On the second occasion, he confounded stereotype by securing simultaneous accreditation at Trinity College, which was then bitterly divided over a proposed merger with its overwhelmingly Catholic rival, and still retained enough vestiges of the fallen Protestant ascendancy to interest a student of sectarian conflict. Now, I haven't read the work of Patrick's, which was referred to earlier in John Gascoigne's talk, but I would be fascinated to do so. These and other visits enabled Patrick O'Farrell to familiarise himself with Irish sources and historical debates, thus avoiding the embarrassing naivety about cultures of origin, all too often displayed by historians of ethnicity and immigration. As he wrote to me in 1984 in a typically gracious letter, I had thought of doing what you're doing now, general work on Irish emigration, had I stayed in Ireland. My reason at that stage was because the Australian questions kept raising Irish questions. O'Farrell's deserved reputation as a distinguished historian of Ireland itself emerged from two provocative and original surveys of Anglo-Irish relationships, focused respectively on Irish stereotypes of the English and English stereotypes of the Irish. In his pithily entitled Ireland's English Question, O'Farrell charted the path by which the Catholic Church became the dominant force in nationalism and the incarnation of Irish resistance to Anglicisation. England and Ireland since 1800, though a slighter work, perhaps made a powerful and disturbing case of the nadir of the Northern Troubles for the logic of relying on violence to achieve constitutional change. Since violence has achieved so much, it could not plausibly be discredited as a practical programme. He concluded that the lessons of the past would seem to confirm a familiar historical theme. When the men of politics fail to accommodate the great problems and changes of their day, they will eventually be replaced as arbiters by the men of violence, which is precisely what has occurred in recent times in Northern Ireland. As Elizabeth Malcolm has pointed out, this bleak conclusion was tempered by O'Farrell's conviction that the sources of division were deeply embedded in religion and culture, so that any contrived political solutions would never work in the longer run. Though less measured and perhaps in some ways less deeply informed, O'Farrell's dissections of Anglo-Irish relations bear comparison with those of another great immigrant historian, the late Oliver MacDonagh. Both had the capacity to formulate major issues in an elegant and novel way and to offer insights that resonate far beyond their particular context. Both, too, were avowedly Catholic scholars informed by faith, though writing, as O'Farrell declared of his work on the Catholic Church, primarily for a non-Catholic audience. Their deaths in quick succession left Australia bereft of two of its finest historians and its most eloquent advocates of the importance of Irishness. More than that, Patrick O'Farrell has left Australians with an unresolved question as to the importance of history itself. Without doubt or question, he wrote, colonial Ireland dies with me and with my like, the transitionals. Transitional to what? To a land of cultural chaos and the walking dead? To fragments and ghettos of uncommunicating materialist minds? Or are we to break the spell that immobilizes the past, liberate its colonial pioneering greatness from the shackles of its sins and negligences, and return it to life with us? Australia's Irish question. When I began work on the Irish in Australia in the late 70s, I soon found myself at odds with what became Patrick O'Farrell's triple identification of the Irish with Catholicism, Gaelicism, and democracy. Apart from those inherent contradictions between the three worldviews that I've already referred to, there seemed little reason to believe that most Irish immigrants, let alone their descendants, adhered to any of them. It was true that the majority of immigrants returned themselves as Catholics in official documents, but the Protestant Irish minority was far larger than most historians had indicated. Among state-assisted Irish immigrants, 4/5 were Catholic, roughly, but the majority of those not requiring assistance were probably Protestants. The 1911 census showed that only 71% of Australia's Irish-born population were nominally Catholic, with little variation between the states apart from an unexpectedly high proportion, 78% in South Australia. Furthermore, over 1/4 of overseas-born Catholics were not Irish. The presence of 40,000 Irish Protestants pointed to the importance of Mid-Ulster and the Black North, with its distinctive and decidedly anti-Catholic culture, as a major secondary origin for Irish Australians, and that was amply recognised by Patrick in his work on emigrant letters, many of them from that region. As for the Catholic majority, why should one assume that most were practising members of the Church, let alone believers in some deeper sense? Statistical historians, numerous in those days but now a dying breed, were busily assembling evidence of extensive intermarriage across religious boundaries, a sure sign that spiritual policing was ineffective in controlling one of life's crucial, though reversible, decisions. In 1911, over 1/4 of Catholic wives had non-Catholic husbands, intermarriage being most prevalent in Tasmania. If many Catholic Irish immigrants had married Protestants, it was clear that the second-generation Irish must include numerous ethnic hybrids of various religious denominations. Furthermore, church attendance and performance of the sacraments were sporadic, though improving, towards the end of the 19th century. Provision of clergy, despite energetic efforts by bishops and missionaries often of Irish birth, remained inadequate in the fast-growing cities as well as the sparsely populated outback. In short, pre-Federation Australia's Catholics were scarcely better regimented than their counterparts in pre-famine Ireland. The difficulty of assigning immigrants to sealed religious categories is illustrated by the case of Captain Francis Edward de Groot, or de Groot, of the faintly fascist New Guard, celebrated for his cavalry charge against the ribbon which John Thomas Lang was about to snip when opening the Sydney Harbour Bridge on Saturday the 19th of March 1932. De Groot was baptised a Catholic but had a Protestant mother. His paternal ancestors were reportedly Flemish Huguenots, but there's some evidence that they were at least in part Jewish. His wife had renounced Protestantism in order to marry de Groot. Though a Catholic, his father was a unionist organiser in Dublin, and Frank served throughout the Great War in cavalry and tank regiments. De Groot's trajectory as a migrant was as convoluted as his religious entanglements. He twice emigrated to Sydney before finally returning to Dublin at the age of 61. In his circulatory migrations, as in his political conduct, he subverted all stereotypes of the Irish Australian, except for outrageousness and unpredictability. De Groot was an object of considerable interest in my own boyhood, as my father claimed to have scooped the bridge story when working for a struggling evening paper grandiosely named The World, dedicated to discrediting Lang's government on behalf of what remained of the Labour left in New South Wales. Brian Fitzpatrick attributed his success to help from a colleague who occupied the only telephone booth near the southern end of the bridge, so that no other journalist could report any untoward incident. An oddly similar claim was made 40 years after the event by Walter Hamilton of The Sun, who likewise secured exclusive use of a telephone by bribing a publican with £1 at Miller's Point. Though I cannot prove that the first edition of The World broadcast the story before the latest final extra edition of The Sun, I prefer my father's account. I went into the State Library this morning to establish the veracity of this story that I used to hear, and there it is. You can see it. That is the amazing bridge incident, The World Country Edition, Saturday, March the 19th, 1932. And there on the front page, the main story would have been based on my father's telephone call, is a poem which Brian wrote called The Bridge Builders, a tribute to the many workers on the bridge who over the previous decade and more had died as a result of industrial accidents. It's not one of Brian Fitzpatrick's best poems, so I will only read one stanza of it. Time stream mars imperceptibly the labours of the hand, but these till time dries up shall be, and these forever stand. No, I'll read one more. The mathematic vision of the engineer's design made lovely beyond derision in an ecstasy of line. Well, perhaps my father was a better historian and journalist than he was a poet. However, if you want to read the other stanzas, all you have to do is to master the microfilm reader technology in the State Library of New South Wales. As for the Gaelic mentality, sometimes attributed to Irish Australians, the evidence was even shakier. Since virtually no Gaelic monoglots remained in the regions of post-famine Ireland that peopled Australia, the immigrants were neither impeded nor culturally enriched by ignorance of the English language. Even bilingualism was unusual, and 4/5 of young adults in those regions in 1861 that peopled Irish Australia had no Irish at all, according to census returns. Since Irish movement to Australia peaked a decade or so after that to the United States, Irish Australians were even less likely to be Gaelic speakers and even more subject to cultural Anglicisation and Americanisation while still at home. Moreover, skeptics such as Don Atkinson and myself boggled at the notion of a distinctive Gaelic mentality or hidden Ireland that had somehow survived centuries of colonisation followed by union, however incomplete in both cases. If interpreted as the origin of Irish passivity and timidity in practical life, its influence was contradicted by ample evidence of Irish upward mobility in Australia and other emigrant destinations, reflecting rational choice in selecting places of settlement, jobs, and marriage partners. For Patrick O'Farrell, admittedly, the significance of Gaelicism was less behavioural than emotional, being reflected in nostalgia for the home place, epitomised by the dream of burial in Ireland. Yet, when Eric Richards and others embarked, as I did, on the study of emigrant correspondence, it became apparent that the expression of nostalgia was commonplace among emigrants of many origins, providing an emotional outlet with little or no practical outcome. By dwelling on home, emigrants reaffirmed solidarity with family and former neighbours without the inconvenience of revisiting them. Even the most eloquent exponent of emigrant nostalgia as proof of the Gaelic worldview of Irish exiles in America, Kirby Miller, has largely renounced this ingenious but ultimately superfluous construction of that slippery entity, the Irish mind. The association between Irishness and attachment to democratic egalitarian values has had many advocates, including my father in an article written for an unpublished volume of essays on the character of Ireland, edited by Bertie Rogers of the BBC and Louis MacNeice. For Brian Fitzpatrick, as for O'Farrell, the Labour movement was the major force for social reform in early and indeed later Australia. Since Irish immigrants and their descendants were notoriously overrepresented in the Labour Party and trades unions, it was tempting to infer that Irish rebelliousness and anti-authoritarianism lay behind the celebrated Australian tendency to be again the government, or, like Senator Kennelly in my boyhood, to affirm on every issue, if I may attempt to render his voice as I recall it, that the government should take some action. I think he had a stutter, you understand. Yet the fabled Irishness of early Australian Labour turned out to be a fiction. Of 183 members of the ALP's federal caucus born before 1900, only 8 were Irish immigrants, compared with 46 from Britain. Even the multitude of Irish union organisers and Labour politicians of Australian birth could be explained more similarly in terms of class than egalitarianism. If Irish origins had any influence over political attitudes in Australia, they should surely have retarded rather than exaggerated democratic and egalitarian behaviour, as distinct from declarations. The political mobilisation of 19th century Ireland, so well analysed by Oliver MacDonagh, was achieved not through liberal exercise of individual conscience, but through populist movements with vague aims, but iron discipline. What the Irish may have brought to Australian politics was expertise in packing people of all classes and educational attainments into tightly organised societies and fraternities, often defined by religion. The Orange Order, the St. Patrick's Societies, and the Hibernian Australasian Catholic Benefit Society certainly carried an Irish imprint. Yet their raison d'etre was the advancement of group interests through exclusive dealing, etc., rather than pursuance of that groundsman's fantasy, a level playing field. The same, of course, might be said of trades unions and political parties. On this issue, my father was perhaps less romantic than Patrick O'Farrell, shamelessly affirming that most political and social combinations, including the Australian Labour movement that he so much advocated, were motivated by collective self-interest, progress towards social justice being measured by the resultant transfer of resources downwards rather than upwards, but always through inequitable collective action. The Irish had no monopoly on Australian egalitarianism and no inhibition in deploying collective power to subdue the individual will. An associated tendency often attributed even today to Irish Australians is intrinsic rebelliousness, linked with antipathy to Britain and the British. This obviously runs counter to the fact that for most of the 19th century, the great majority of Irish nationalists and also Irish unionists pursued parliamentary or constitutional strategies rather than advocating or practicing physical force. The subsequent convulsions of 1912 to 23, though indeed violent, had little personal impact on Irish Australians in the virtual absence of Irish immigration in that period. Though Irish politics was suffused with commemorative rhetoric extolling former revolutionaries and counterinsurgents, whether United Irishmen or yeomen, this was mainly an expression not of intention but of nostalgia, rather like the emigrants' yearning for home, hankering back to the romance of violence. Admittedly, Australia's convict population included a few hundred political cases, sometimes dubiously inflated to thousands, by incorporating agrarian offenders as if they were political rebels. This gave a local slant to the sentimental veneration of the men of 98, 48, and 67, without generating any significant support for the few souls associated with the Irish Republican Brotherhood and its main American partner, Clan Gael. A 19th century Irish upbringing supplied emigrants with a rich rhetorical armory of Anglophobia and romanticization of violence, combined with acceptance of the practical advantages of cultural assimilation and lawful conduct. Should we conclude that Irish Catholicity, Gaeldom, egalitarianism, and rebelliousness prevailed only in the imagination of historians, and that the Irish in Australia were indistinguishable in these respects from their English or Scottish neighbours? Some, like Manning Clark, have dismissed the importance of ethnicity as a factor in either defining or dividing early Australian society. When placed in broad perspective, the characteristics differentiating Catholic Irish from Protestant Irish or British settlers, and indeed those differentiating the Anglophone populations of Ireland and Britain, shrink into Don Atkinson's small differences. Yet such small differences, when operative in a relatively homogeneous society, can have powerful polarizing effects. The attitudes and behavior of Catholic and Protestant immigrants may have differed little, as confirmed by their letters home, yet this did not prevent the periodic eruption in Australia of ugly sectarian confrontations, and especially rhetoric. Irish and English emigration may both have been dominated by young, unmarried people with few skills, yet the distinctive features of Irish migration, even fewer families, fewer skills, and more women, set the two streams apart in the eyes of contemporaries as well as historians. Small differences were capable of defining distinct and sometimes hostile ethnic groups, whether in Belfast, Ireland, or Belfast, Victoria. And even if most Irish settlers were without religious enthusiasm, thoroughly anglicised, pragmatic in politics, and obedient to civil authority, there are enough genuine or apparent exceptions to generate ethnic stereotypes with real force. Much of O'Farrell's most compelling work for me concerns the means by which those stereotypes were generated, expressed, exploited, and appropriated by Australia's Irish themselves. The clerical myth of Irish fidelity to faith and fatherland was self-fulfilling, enabling church rhetoricians to create an identification between Irishness and Catholicity that prevailed more strongly among later generations than among the immigrants themselves. This not only reinforced the communal bonds forged by parish organisations and denominational schooling, but contributed to a more positive view of Ireland by descendants who had never been there than that expressed in many emigrant letters. The equation between a distant Gaelic past and Catholic piety was tirelessly affirmed by Irish Catholic rhetoricians, encouraging Irish Australians to idealise their ancestors as members of a more egalitarian society than modern Ireland or even Australia. Cardinal Moran of Sydney was perhaps the most methodical exponent, taking over the St. Patrick's Day ceremony in 1896 and declaring shortly before his death in 1911 the 24th of May was not merely Empire Day, but the feast of the patroness of the Church in Australia, indeed Australian Day. Church, ethnic origin, and imperial patriotism were thus neatly twisted into a single festival. The mythology of the Australian left was suffused with equally romantic, yet useful, notions about the seminal influence of Irish rebels and radicals, offering welcome relief from the aridities of Karl Marx or Sidney Webb, still worse, as a source of inspiration for the labour movement. Invoking an Irish legacy had become a valuable tool in Australian politics, whether focused on religion or class. Irish questions, however misconceived, were until quite recently an essential ingredient of Australian political discourse and have yet to lose their hold on popular imagination. In his histrionic mode, Patrick O'Farrell's prose resonates with the themes and dreams once prevalent in Irish Australia, declaiming and reclaiming the history which more workaday historians merely relate. Ireland's Australian question. Australia was never a major destination for Irish emigrants, accounting for at most 1/12 of those living outside Ireland in the later 19th century. Less than 350,000 natives of Ireland are known to have reached Australia by 1914. Whereas the United States housed over 2 million Irish by the 1870s, Australia's peak Irish population scarcely reached 200,000. Proportionately, of course, the Irish were a larger component of the immigrant population in Australia than they were in the United States or in Britain. In 1871, natives of Ireland accounted for 1/8 of the population and 1/4 of those born outside Australia. Yet from an Irish perspective, those who chose the Australian colonies were a minor element in the global diaspora. Many households in Munster and Ulster developed Australian as well as American links, but sheer weight of numbers ensured that the American connection tended to be more vital and to last longer. When I finally identified my own Irish cousins in Leitrim and Clare, they had no recollection of any long-departed Australian black or white sheep. Having established that I probably had no nefarious intention of laying claim to family properties, they welcomed the news from Australia and myself in traditional fashion: whisky at Fitzpatrick's Cayley Inn at Mohill, County Leitrim, bacon and eggs from the Gallaghers of Moyrisk, County Clare. When working on emigrant networks for my study of Irish-Australian correspondence, Oceans of Consolation, I found that Australia rarely figured in local folklore or pub lore, whereas everyone was conscious of American relatives and well informed about American life. Apart from jests about Irish convicts and gold diggers, Australia had few historical or personal associations for the Irish kinsfolk of those who had once chosen one of the world's most distant and hazardous destinations, or had it chosen for them. Admittedly, Irish interest and involvement in Australia have intensified in recent years, partly through the ease with which students and young people can enjoy a remunerative Australian vacation for 6 months or so. Australia has undoubtedly re-entered Irish pub lore as an alluring destination for emigrants as well as holiday makers in search of sun, surf, sport and beer. Yet contemporary Ireland's Australian question has little to do, I think, with the distant past, when so many forgotten emigrants left in the hope of a decent livelihood beyond the foaming billows. Even in the 19th century, there was little to distinguish the emigrants who made for Australia from those choosing more popular destinations. Once again, my research indicated interesting but small differences. Admittedly, Australia was unique in the fact that most Irish settlers came with state assistance, whether a free passage as a convict or domestic servant, or through remittance and nomination schemes requiring deposits from previous settlers. This should have enabled the colonial and imperial authorities to select desirable categories in order to maximize the human capital raised by their investment, just as contemporary Australian governments limit long-term work visas to those with specified skills. In fact, the state's attempt at social engineering foundered because the most desirable groups, English or Scottish Protestants and unmarried women, resisted all enticements, obliging the authorities to accept far more Irish Catholics than intended. Though awkward politically, this had no negative impact, I think, on human capital, since Irish convicts and uneducated farmers' children turned out to be at least as versatile in making a useful Australian living as more sophisticated newcomers from urban Britain. The outcome was an emigrant population whose distribution by sex, age, literacy, and previous occupation was remarkably similar to that of the American Irish. In other words, those who went to Australia, the profile was shaped by the wishes of Irish would-be emigrants, not by the social engineers, to a large degree. My investigation of the regional origins and settlement patterns of Irish emigrants did suggest some distinctive features of the Australian stream, though insignificant by comparison with the smaller stream, say, to Argentina. Relatively few came from Connacht, the poorest province and source of the most intensive emigration to the United States. And once in the Australian colonies, the Irish were just as likely to live in cities as in rural areas. virtually no difference in the propensity to live in urban areas and rural, less inclined than the English or Scots to risk residence in the outback. These patterns contrasted sharply with settlement in Britain and the United States, where the Irish tended to cluster in certain highly urbanized regions, offering good prospects of unskilled or semi-skilled employment. Australia, unlike America, also attracted a substantial number of Irish settlers with professional qualifications, leading to the legendary prominence of Irish-trained lawyers and doctors in the emerging colonial professions. Australians should thank or blame Trinity College for much of this invasion. I have to mention my home college a number of times in any foreign presentation. A consequence of systematic overproduction of professional graduates by a university serving the British Empire as much as Ireland itself. Yet in most respects, the collective profile of Irish Australians was unremarkable, and the group's distinctiveness was blurred by the impressive readiness and ability of emigrants to continue migration indefinitely. Historians have long since abandoned the fiction, fostered by reliance on official enumerations, that most emigrants leave A in order to settle permanently in B. Study of emigrant correspondence and memoirs, along with reconstitution of family histories and trajectories by genealogists, suggests extensive onward and circular migration throughout the Anglophone world. Semi-literate Irish Australians thought nothing of chasing gold across the continent and onto New Zealand, South Africa or California, or pursuing risky riches in Canada and even South America. Long before the notion of globalization had been invented, millions of emigrant Irish had sampled this onerous but thrilling experience, as Ronan has already pointed out. It follows that Irish Australians should not be regarded as a fully settled, isolated or cohesive community. They were merely a current in the vast surge of humanity that poured forth from 19th century Ireland and circulated around the globe. Should we conclude that the Australian connection had no particular significance for Ireland, so that any Australian question was trivial? Examination of the writings and actions of Irish politicians suggests otherwise. Though few by comparison with the self-identified Irish in America, Australian supporters of Irish nationalist movements were disproportionately generous in funding causes such as the Land League, the Irish National League, and the Republican Revolutionary Movement of 1916 to 21. Michael Collins, Eamon de Valera, and Harry Boland were all keenly interested in raising money and publicity through the Irish Self-Determination League in Australia and other organizations, and an emissary was dispatched from America to Sydney with admittedly farcical results. Osmond Thomas Grattan Esmond, Catholic heir to a Wexford baronetcy and son of a nationalist parliamentarian and also early Sinn Féiner, sailed from Vancouver in December 1920 with the intention of rousing support for the Republic in Australia and New Zealand. Though presenting himself with some justification as an Oxford gentleman travelling round the world second class, he was quickly identified as a Republican emissary and prevented from disembarking in various ports of call. In Sydney, having refused to swear the oath of allegiance as required of British subjects under a recently proclaimed war precautions regulation, he was kept on the boat in Sydney harbour for 2 months, so he reported, over a mile from land, and it was impossible to swim ashore owing to the great number of sharks. On the return voyage, he managed to land clandestinely in Auckland with the connivance of Irish policemen, was confronted by the armed warriors of Fiji, who were drawn up in full paint with white aprons, and was arrested but escaped imprisonment in Vancouver, having thought it best to wear the monocle and talk of all the lords and baronets I could remember. Esmond therefore had no opportunity to secure recognition of the Republic or to prime Irish Australians for Harry Boland's proposed race vendetta against the British Empire. I should mention the quotations I've made from Esmond's report of his amusing tour are those which he communicated to Harry Boland, who felt they should be Bowdlerised before being submitted to the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Republican government in Dublin. So a much duller version may be found in the printed selections of documents in Irish foreign policy. Despite the reluctance of Irish emigrants to involve themselves in revolutionary conspiracies in Australia, massive rhetorical support for home rule and self-determination was expressed by Irish societies and Australian politicians, not always of Irish extraction. Support for representative government for Ireland was far broader in Australia than in Britain, since most Australians had no difficulty in reconciling imperial patriotism with their own form of self-government as a dominion. On the other hand, the Orange Order and the Ulster Unionist Council were also able to summon practical assistance from Australians, including prominent public figures, in their potentially violent campaign against Home Rule, portrayed as the first step towards dismemberment of the entire empire. So for this subgroup, imperial patriotism demanded opposition to Home Rule out of duty to the preservation of that empire. Australia thus became a significant source of financial and moral sustenance for most protagonists in Irish politics. Australia also supplied Irish nationalists with a valuable example of how to coexist cosily with Britain while achieving a measure of national independence. This theme was sententiously expounded in 1887 in The Irish in Australia by James Francis Hogan, who had left Tipperary for Victoria as a toddler in 1856, but returned in 1893 to become anti-Parnellite MP for Mid-Tipperary. Hogan echoed the playwright Dion Boucicault's opinion that our countrymen find in the colonies a fair and open field for the exercise of their abilities and their industry. Their onward march is not obstructed by racial or religious prejudices. If only Britain were to treat Ireland as a self-governing dominion like Australia, rather than as a subject colony maintained through the threat of force, Ireland's English question would easily be settled. Hogan extolled the Irish in Australia for the remarkable manner in which they've succeeded in rendering full and satisfactory allegiance to the land of their adoption and all its local institutions, whilst never forgetting the filial loyalty they owed to the land of their fathers and all their cherished traditions. John and William Redmond, both of whom married Australians and made several successful visits while campaigning for Home Rule, hoped that Ireland too would eventually evolve into a contented self-governing state within the empire, as the empire itself evolved into a second Commonwealth. On occasion, the imperial patriotism displayed by Irish Australians admittedly was too much for Irish nationalist leaders to swallow, particularly during the South African campaign of 1899 to 1902, which Home Rulers and many British Liberals also had strongly denounced. Catholic volunteers comprised 1/5 of the Commonwealth horse in Australia, only slightly less than the Catholic component of the country's population in 1901, 23%. In Queensland, Catholics were actually overrepresented in the Commonwealth horse. The associated eruption of imperial sentiment had demoralising effects on Australian Irish nationalists, as John Redmond was informed by John Ford of Gympie in 1903. It is, in my opinion, absolutely necessary to send a delegation in order to revive the interest in Irish national work, which is now almost dead. Although, as a matter of fact, a very great number of the Irish out here are, since the outbreak of the Boer War, thoroughly cowed and would hesitate to identify themselves with a mission from Ireland, which would be too outspoken, not to say violent. Since you're out here, the majority of the Irish born have died, and the Irish Australian, as a rule, the second generation, does not inherit the parents' love for the old land. Love for the old land, in this account, still seemed inconsistent with fighting Britain's imperial wars. By 1914, however, when Redmond famously endorsed Britain's declaration of war on Germany and urged his supporters to join the forces and fight wherever the firing line might extend, the conflict between Irish and imperial patriotism seemed to have been resolved. Though Irishmen were underrepresented in the wartime forces, most of the discrepancy can be explained by the predominance of family farms in the Irish economy and the general reluctance of agriculturists to enlist in Ireland. Despite long-standing nationalist antagonism to recruitment, more Catholics than Protestants actually joined the forces in Ireland, and initially very few nationalists broke with Redmond over his support for the war effort. Australian participation was even more intense than Irish, in the absence of conscription in both countries. Ireland sent about 210,000 men into the wartime services, of whom at least 32,000 died. Australia, whose population in 1911 of about 4.5 million was similar to Ireland's, sent 330,000 men overseas with the Australian Imperial Force, of whom 60,000 died. So it's 50% or more in excess of the Irish figures. As in South Africa, the recorded Catholic component of the AIF was just over 1/5, marginally below the Catholic proportion of younger adults in 1921. A special analysis of those who had served abroad during the Great War, undertaken for the Australian census of 1933, did show a slightly smaller Catholic component than that, but also revealed that natives of Ireland were fully represented. Indeed, they were more likely to enlist than native-born white Australians. Despite the persistent but baseless myth that Australian Catholics under the influence of Daniel Mannix were reluctant to volunteer and particularly opposed conscription, Mannix himself emphasized the imperial patriotism of himself and his flock by parading and feting 14 Catholic VCs and thousands of ex-servicemen on St. Patrick's Day in 1920. A surviving newsreel shows the bemedalled heroes lining up to kiss the Archbishop's ring. In an Australian context, even support for Irish republicanism, as expressed by Mannix, was consistent with symbolic endorsement of the Empire's war. When committing Irish nationalists to the war effort on 15th of September 1914, Redmond had drawn a positive lesson for Ireland from the response of the Dominions. The whole world has been struck by the spectacle of unity in the Empire, in India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and last but not least in South Africa and Ireland. Just as Botha and Smuts have been able to say in the speeches which were published a few days ago that the concession of free institutions to South Africa has changed the men who but 10 or a little more years ago were your bitter enemy in the field into your loyal comrades and fellow citizens in the Empire. Just as truthfully I can say to you that by what of recent years has happened in this country with the democracy of England, Ireland has been transformed from what George Meredith described a short time ago as the broken arm of England into one of the strongest bulwarks of the Empire. Now, you'd have to be an opera singer to get through an entire sentence by John Redmond without a breath a couple of times en route. John Redmond's dream did not dissipate in 1916. For Kevin O'Higgins and other founders of the Irish Free State, as for Redmond, dominions like Australia offered the example and promise of national freedom protected rather than constrained by the economic and military shelter of the Empire. Ireland's Australian question amounted to this: was it possible for Ireland, despite its tumultuous history of subjection, resentment, rebellion, collaboration, and partial assimilation, to replicate Australia's successful emergence as a dominion? Despite recurrent suggestions that Ireland might do well to rejoin the Commonwealth, even today, the declaration of a republic in 1949 seemed to settle that question in the negative. But it raised a broader question, never far from Patrick O'Farrell's thought. Could Ireland, after all, live at ease with its British neighbour? A few months ago, that question too was apparently resolved, positively, at least symbolically, through the wistful, silent presence of a tiny old lady in 2 Dublin Gardens of Remembrance. By paying respect to Irishmen killed in rebellions, as well as in the Great War, Her Majesty the Queen unleashed an astonishing outburst of public sympathy and admiration, as if the old antagonists had become equal partners through shared commemoration of their losses. Perhaps, after all, the Irish had begun to break the spell that immobilizes the past. Thank you.